best of note.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So the other question is, can the jinn actually possess human beings or not? Okay. Can the jinn actually enter somebody's body? This was actually a long, I would say, debate between scholars. And the reason for the debate is number one, there isn't really like a solid, clear text that said that it was impossible. Um, and there's also not a clear text that said that it was impossible. So, what was the text that they were really referring to as impossible or possible? So, the ayah really is in Surah Al Baqarah, and it was really speaking about the people that relate to interest. So they're so happy about the interest that they got doubling, and that وَمَا يَقُومُونَ إِلَّا كَمَا يَقُومُ الَّذِي يَتَخَبَّطُهُ الشَّيْطَانُ مِنَ الْمَسِّ. So the word يَتَخَبَّطُهُ الشَّيْطَانُ مِنَ الْمَسِّ was really the key word, because يَتَخَبَّطُهُ means to tremble somebody, to smack somebody, to, we're talking about takhabbut here, in where there's some kind of a trembling. A shaitan, that it's talking about the shaitan trembling a person min al mess, from mess. But here are a number of different reasons why they had differences of opinions, even though the sentence seems very straightforward. So number one is that the first opinion, let's use it, first opinion, second opinion, the first group of scholars actually said that mess is impossible. And the way they responded to the ayah, they said, well, this is actually saying كما يقوم الذي يتخبطه من الشيطان من المس. They said the word kama is a form of comparison, it's a form of tashbih. Not always does the tashbih necessarily have to be realistic. So I can say Asma is flying like a bird. It doesn't mean that she had become a bird. It just means she is flying in where she's somehow moving rapidly, like a bird. So I compared the speed part of it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that she had become a bird. So it can also be that it tashbih can also be in where the person, you can use tashbih, and even if it's something not factual. So I would say, for example, oh, she was as beautiful as a unicorn, even though we know unicorns don't actually exist, but we just use our fantasy in that way to speak about that. So that ayah, because of the differences of opinions and how we interpret the ayah, that actually took the other scholars into saying, well, wait a minute, no, there are actually, exorcism is real, and we know it from this ayah. And they said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not give a comparison that is not factual. So you will not find an ayah that's talking about unicorns, or an ayah that's talking about non-factual things. And I want you guys to listen to this conversation. Imagine these two scholars are sitting in front of each other, and they're real scholars, all right? They're scholars in hadith, scholars in fiqh, scholars in tafsir, and they're having this conversation right there. And the other one is going to respond, well, this is not necessarily based on what is factual and what is not, but this is giving a comparison to how they would imagine a person facing exorcism would be acting, like a person going insane, a person acting in some kind of a trembling motion or bodily movement that is very involuntary. Now, here's the thing: is that the other scholars, they said, well, wait a minute. If we're actually talking about exorcism, we should also relate to what we see in real life. So, what do we relate to real life? So, well, they said we actually see exorcism even in different cases that we get. Do you really get cases of exorcism? So, and that takes us into another debate. And when we're talking about mental illness, it was really in its, I would say, in its beginning and an initial conversation in studying the human mind, studying behavior, etc. And even until today, we don't really have a lot of information about, for example, when we're talking about schizophrenia. All right, when we're speaking about schizophrenia, we're actually talking about an illness that until now is really very early in its, let's say, studying and studies, and very early in its even the academia, in how they could interpret it, how they can explain it, even the medications. But we definitely see medications not necessarily healing the person with schizophrenia. Why am I talking about schizophrenia? So when you look at schizophrenia, it is probably the the most mental illness in where the person is really hearing sounds, the person does these behaviors and these behaviors are definitely influencing the person, in where it's telling them to commit suicide, to attack, to burn down. The person is also constantly thinking of themselves as somehow holy compared to others, and or that they have some kind of a divine religious connection. And then from that standpoint, they would go into speaking to things that we don't see. So even when we speak about jinn, let's say it that way, whether we want to say it is possible or we want to say it's not possible, this is actually part of the unseen. Can we necessarily diagnose a person that, yes, we are very sure that that person has jinn or not? We really don't have textual evidence to 100%, which is قطعي الدلالة. قطعية ثبوت and قطعي الدلالة. What's the difference? قطعي الدلالة and قطعي الثبوت. So قطعي الثبوت, meaning that it's authentic in its in its source, just like the Quran. قطعي الدلالة, in where it only holds one interpretation, and you cannot go into a figurative meaning unless there is another what we'd say, in where it's pushing you towards only one interpretation. So when we say it only has one interpretation, قطعي الثبوت قطعي الدلالة, that's why when we look at that ayah, that ayah having differences of opinions tells us that it's not necessarily قطعية الدلالة. It can have different interpretations because of that kama, because of that tashbih. But can we necessarily say, no, we cannot prove that someone is, facing exorcism, or this is impossible, or that nothing in Islam proves it, or there's evidence in Islam to prove it? Both opinions actually have strong evidences, and by looking at that same ayah. So what about the hadith? Do we have situations of hadith of exorcism? So we do have, for example, a hadith where you had a sahabi that was sara'ahu al-jinn. We were told sara'ahu al-jinn. When we have that hadith only, really, we have another hadith. Well, that sara'ahu al-jinn is that he was actually attacked by a snake, and then later it was told that it was by the jinn. Is it the Prophet ﷺ that said that? No. So actually the Sahaba and their own explanation based on their information, that sara'ahu al-jinn, and it became something common that they had transmitted from one to another. But in the end is that we don't necessarily have specific cases where the Prophet ﷺ had cured exorcism, a person coming in with exorcism, the Prophet ﷺ hitting the man and telling the jinn to come out. We don't have one single report of that sort. So what about those that raqis and what they do and where they're yelling at the person, get out, and would tell him to get out of his toe or get out of his finger or whatever it is. This is more of an empirical, meaning it's really most on their experience, the different raqis experience, and nothing from Quran and Sunnah to actually say, well, here's how you get the jinn out. And because there's nothing, let's say, evident in its resource, evident in its implication, evident in its interpretation, to actually say there's only one thing, is that yes, jinn does actually go into people's bodies, control them, etc. And that's why when you see the scholars that said that this is impossible, they also depended on the ayah, and where the shaitan on judgment day, he said, he will say that I don't have power over them, that I don't have power over them. I just called them, that I just da'awtuhum, I just called you to do the wrong thing, and you just answered it, but I don't have power over you. So that was one other evidence for those that said. Now, can we actually say for sure that that person is facing exorcism? Like I said, it is something, I would say, the least I could say is really worth of searching, really worth of, and you can't necessarily just look at one situation, but I did not used to believe in this, but when I had seen so many cases, it really got me thinking. It really got me thinking, and all I went to was say, I don't know. I really don't know. This is something ghaib. This is something beyond what we know about the world. It is definitely a possibility. And even when we look at, psychiatry and all the different things that they would study, psychiatry is just to study, the human brain, the behavior, people's behaviors, etc. They are not whatsoever going to ever have the tools to study something that is part of al-ghaib. There's no way that one day psychiatry is going to come to a conclusion that they found jinn somehow in an MRI scan. There's no way. The MRIs, the different scans, all these things are designed to research and scan things that are materialistic things. They're not designed to find and scan jinn. So this is impossible. So to base it on that and say, well, that means they don't exist, and to say, well, psychiatrists say don't exist, psychologists say that these things don't exist. Well, you want to remember that the basis of their research is really dependent on materialistic things anyways. So you can't use their evidence. They're not trained, and they definitely don't have the tools to study things that are ghaib. So they don't have the tools to study the things that are ghaib, and therefore we can't base their empirical research to study something that is not and can never be studied based on empirical research. It could only be studied through text. If it's ghaib, you can only study it with text. And even with text, we could see that it is not necessarily straightforward, but it can have something worth of studying. And before we right away say, no, this is all fantasy, there's no evidence there, this is impossible, this person is made of fire, which is the jinn, and we're made of nar, and you can't mix the both, etc. You're using your understanding of the chemical elements and applying it on jinn. Your jinn is not part of what you know of chemical elements. To somehow use your understanding of chemical elements and actually apply them on things that are ghaibiyya is really it's complete nonsense. But in the end is that it's really Allahu Alam. It is, I would just say it is very interesting when you actually see some of those cases and the people in front of you doing things that are definitely beyond human capacity. And I know that people with mental illnesses can actually do things that are beyond human capacity in many, many times with their adrenaline and all that. But there are certain things that it's beyond a human body to even do, regardless of whether they're adrenaline or not. It's just, it just doesn't work. But subhanAllah, I wouldn't rush to say it's impossible. And I wouldn't rush to say it is possible. I will just say it's really worth researching, and it's really worth looking into. Do your ruqyas and do your adhkar night and day, and protect yourself from what you are able to see and what you're not able to see by doing adhkar. And even when you look at the ayat, when you look at the hadith, it's speaking about speaking about seeking refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the things that you can see and the things that you can't see. So are these things that we cannot see, and where the hadith, for example, tells us that the shaitan would urinate in our ears or the shaitan would control in any way, we just leave it. This is part of al-ghaib. But we'll just say the most important thing, whether it can fully control us or not, in the end is that do that tahseen, protect yourself from all the different things that might harm you by doing the dhikr. That's the most important thing. If somebody wants to unmute themselves and actually ask questions, that's okay. Before I end the live stream, that's okay. Nobody wants to be, go ahead, Esma, if you want to ask the question, go ahead.
So the question I had before was about, if you seen someone that was being possessed and then you were interacting with the jinn, you said previously that it's impermissible to speak to the jinn. So could you expand on that?
Right. So generally speaking, it's actually impermissible to talk to the jinn. You cannot hold a conversation with the jinn. And scholars of fiqh had actually mentioned that many of the books of fiqh, that it's actually impermissible to talk to the jinn because of the harm that they will cause. So the last conversation you would want to hold is really conversation with the jinn. All scholars actually agree that you cannot, and it's not permissible. And even if we are to assume that exorcism is real, even if we're to assume that, all right, don't talk to them directly and say things like, what are you doing here? What else did you do? Where are you from, etc. This is a conversation you don't really want to hold with the shaitan, or the jinn. Just do your healing and do what you were trained, let's say it that way, even though there's really no evidence. There's no evidence, or there's no particular way, even though it doesn't really hold any foundation that this is how and this is what you do for ruqya. But you don't want to hold definitely any conversation directly. So even for those raqis that will say get out or etc., you can say that, get out, but you don't want to ask questions and hold a conversation with the jinn whatsoever. Even regardless of what we assume, but you don't want to hold a conversation. So did I answer that one, Asma?